Hey everyone, welcome to chapter 15. We are going to finish up the nervous system with our autonomic nervous system. So I know we've been talking a lot in regards to the autonomic nervous system and referencing it a lot. So I just wanted to finish up the unit with the details of the autonomic nervous system. It can be a little challenging, but I'm going to break down everything for you for what you need for this class. We're also going to talk a little bit about the visceral sensory. So the autonomic nervous system is just visceral motor, but we're also going to touch a little bit on the visceral sensory neurons as well. So what are we going to be talking about today? So first, we're really going to just cover the basics of the autonomic nervous system or our visceral motor system, right? And so then we're going to compare and contrast a little bit of the visceral versus somatic motor systems, right? So we've been talking mostly about our somatic motor systems until now, and so now we're going to talk a little bit about visceral and why it's a little bit different. And there's two major divisions of the autonomic nervous system, and that's sympathetic and parasympathetic. So we're going to really compare and contrast those two divisions, and that's what we're going to spend the majority of the time of the lecture talking about. And then we're going to talk about the pathways, so the autonomic nervous system pathways, so to and from the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system, and what organs they innervate. And then we're going to touch a little bit, like I said, on the visceral sensory neurons, but we're going to spend most of our time on the autonomic nervous system. And then we're going to talk a little bit also about just the central nervous system and the control over the autonomic nervous system, because it's kind of interesting, but maybe obvious to some of you guys that after now we've talked about the central nervous system so much, it makes sense that it has control over the autonomic nervous system. And we don't have conscious control over it. There are certain things we have a little bit of voluntary control over, but the majority is all through just the central nervous system and no conscious control from the cortex. So then we'll finish up with the disorders and development, as we usually do. So what is the autonomic nervous system? It's a system of motor neurons, right? So motor has to do with movement, we usually think about, but it's really about stimulating our organs and our tissues in our body. So we're not on the sensory side, right? So this is our general visceral motor system. And we divide that into sympathetic and parasympathetic. And we're in the peripheral nervous system when we're talking about the autonomic nervous system. So both divisions of the autonomic nervous system are going to innervate smooth muscle. So where do we find smooth muscle? Think GI tract, respiratory tract, and urinary and reproductive tracts. Cardiac muscle, right? Our heart and glands of the body, right? For secretion of different substances throughout the body, from saliva to gastric juices and things like that, right? And so what is it going to regulate, right? So we're going to regulate heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, so digestion rate, urination, things like that that we don't have voluntary control over, right? So this is just a little bit of review. We've seen this table before. So now we're going to go down that motor division into that autonomic nervous system, into the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. And again, we're going to touch a little bit on the sensory, our visceral sensory division towards the end of the lecture. So let's compare a little bit about our somatic motor versus our autonomic motor, which is our visceral motor. So we've talked mostly about the somatic motor system, and we've been talking about one motor neuron, right, starting in the central nervous system, extending out to our skeletal muscles. right? Now, these axons of these neurons are very well myelinated, and we said that not all axons are myelinated, but if they are, they conduct impulses more rapidly. So the signal gets from the central nervous system to those skeletal muscles very quickly, right? It's almost instantaneous from the time you say, I'm going to move my arm, to moving your arm, right? Pretty much instantaneous. So that is a very fast signal. So what is the difference in the visceral motor? We have actually a chain of motor neurons. So usually we just have 2 motor neurons. And the first motor neuron is called the preganglionic neuron. And it's going to go from the central nervous system to a peripheral ganglion. So we said, what is a ganglion? We talked about it when we were talking about our sensory neurons, because the sensory neurons were special because their cell bodies lived outside the central nervous system in a ganglion, right? So we talked about the dorsal root ganglion or posterior root ganglion, and that's where those cell bodies live. So ganglions are just where cell bodies live of neurons outside the central nervous system. So in the autonomic nervous system, we actually have quite a few peripheral ganglion throughout our body. And so that preganglionic neuron is going to synapse in the ganglion with another motor neuron, and that motor neuron is the postganglionic neuron. So it'll extend from the ganglion to whatever organ it's innervating, or gland, or whatever that may be. So that's different, right? So now we have a 2 motor chain versus that 1 motor neuron in the somatic motor. And what's also different is that the conduction of the impulse is quite a bit slower in the autonomic nervous system than in the somatic, because our axons are either thinly myelinated or non-myelinated. So the impulse doesn't have to move as quickly. We don't have to say, move my heart right this second, right? We have no control over it. It's something that is just built in, so those signals don't have to be as fast. We'll talk a little bit about the sympathetic system, because that does have to respond quite quickly, but overall we have these thinly myelinated or non-myelinated axons. Also, we have to synapse, right? So we have 2 motor neurons in a chain, so that's going to slow us down too, because we have to go through that ganglion before we reach our effector gland or organ. So don't panic, but this is the picture from your textbook, and it's just comparing the somatic motor to the visceral motor. So on the left-hand side in red, you just have all the somatic motor innervation. So showing that the axons are heavily myelinated in those red myelin sheaths, just showing that there's a single axon, right, a single neuron coming from the central nervous system to that muscle. So there are no peripheral ganglia in the somatic motor system, but then if we look on the right hand side, we're looking at our autonomic nervous system, and we split that into the sympathetic in green and parasympathetic in purple. So the differences we see here is that we have some lightly myelinated axons. Those preganglionic neurons are maybe lightly, myelinated in the green and purple colors. And then we're going to synapse on a ganglia. So we have peripheral ganglia, and either they're going to be near the vertebral column in the sympathetic nervous system we'll talk about, or they're going to be near or on a target organ, such as in the parasympathetic nervous system. So we do have ganglion out in the peripheral nervous system, and we use those in the autonomic nervous system. So we have 2 chains, and then those postganglionic neuron from the chains are not myelinated at all, so they're non-myelinated, okay? So those are the differences I just wanted you to point out. Don't worry about all the other details of this picture just yet. So don't worry about the neurotransmitters. Don't worry about where they're coming off of in the central nervous system. We'll talk a little bit about that for our autonomic nervous system, but again, we're just showing the differences. We've got two neurons in the autonomic nervous system, so we have a chain and we have ganglia, and they're not as myelinated or not myelinated at all. Okay? So now let's talk about those divisions of the autonomic nervous system. So this is really the crux of the autonomic nervous system and how it functions. So we have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions. And again, in both divisions, we have a chain of two motor neurons. So all of these guys are really going to innervate mostly the same structure. So that means mostly the same organs and glands, but they're going to have opposite effects on those organs and glands. Okay? So the sympathetic division, think flight or fight, right? So this is really a mobilization of the body during extreme situations. So sympathetic is fight or flight, and then parasympathetic is really the routine maintenance of the body. And so this is our rest and digest division. So they're opposites, right? So if one is going to stimulate an organ, say the heart, right? So that's the easiest one to think about. So if we increase the heart rate with the sympathetic, we're going to decrease the heart rate in parasympathetic. So let's first talk about the sympathetic nervous system. So this is our fight or flight or response to kind of extreme situations. So you can think of, E for extremes. You can think of exercise, but think, extreme exercise. Excitement, again, extreme excitement, and emergency situations. So really, the sympathetic response is to help us respond to dangerous situations. So this is really where it comes from, right? So just imagine you have to run away from some dangerous situation, probably some predator back in the day, right? Like a lion. So you're going to increase your heart rate and respiratory rate. You're going to increase that blood and oxygen supply to your skeletal muscles. So you're going to kind of vasoconstrict or kind of restrict the blood flow to other parts of the body. Okay, so you're going to increase the blood flow to your skeletal muscles. You're going to dilate your pupils so you can see further away. And you're going to dilate those bronchioles in your lungs to help oxygenate your lungs or oxygenate your blood, right, in your lungs. And what you don't really want to be doing when you're running away from a dangerous situation is you're going to inhibit some of these things that you don't need, right? So you're going to inhibit the digestive tract and the urinary tract. Now you might say, after a really extreme situation or even during, some people might urinate or something like that, right? Well, you actually have an overcompensation from the parasympathetic system when you have such an extreme sympathetic response. But anyways, we don't need to go into that. So we're focusing more on the right-hand side for this little picture, right? So it's showing that they're actually innervating a lot of the same organs and glands, but a plus sign next to it means it's going to stimulate it. A negative sign means it's going to inhibit it, okay? So if we go through the sympathetic system, right, we're dilating our pupils. Skin is one of the few things that the sympathetic system innervates and the parasympathetic does not. So when your hair stands on end, that you like goosebumps, right? That is the sympathetic system, okay? It's going to inhibit your salivary glands, your stomach, your pancreas, your gallbladder. and your bladder itself, because you don't want to be undergoing digestion and urination during an extreme situation. But you are going to dilate the airways, increase your heart rate, have your liver get glucose, sugar out to your body, right? And your adrenal gland as well. And we'll talk about the adrenal gland, and specifically the adrenal medulla. So remember, we just talked about our endocrine system and the adrenal medulla being responsible for epinephrine and norepinephrine, and it's directly stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system. And then also you have a little bit of, so the genitals are very complex because they're innervated by both systems, and they both stimulate the genitals. So, and you need both systems to be able to, and in this case they're saying a male, to achieve an erection and an ejaculation. So you can compare and contrast the two sides, and in general, if one is going to be stimulated, the other system is going to inhibit it. Okay? So now let's talk about the parasympathetic nervous system. So this is going to be the opposite to sympathetic. We are going to rest and digest. So our this is most active when our body is at rest. So we're more concerned with conserving energy, right? So our heart rate, blood pressure, respiration is all going to be at kind of a low normal level. So we're mostly going to be concerned with housekeeping activities. So our energy is going to go towards digestion, elimination of feces, and urine. So if you look, we're looking on the left-hand side of our picture now, and you can see that we're constricting the pupils. We're stimulating the salivary glands, the stomach, the pancreas, gallbladder, and bladder. But then we're kind of decreasing our heart rate and respiratory rate, or our lungs. We're kind of constricting our airways. Okay, so the opposite to all of our sympathetic responses. So let's go through some of the physical differences between the divisions of the autonomic nervous system. So we know that they do completely opposite things, right? So if one stimulates something, then we're going to inhibit something else. But there's also some differences in the anatomy of the two divisions as well. So I want you guys to know these differences. So the first difference is that they're going to originate from different regions of the central nervous system. So those preganglionic neurons are going to originate in different areas. So some are going to originate in the brainstem, where others are going to come from the spinal cord, specifically in the thoracolumbar region. Okay. So when we talk about the sympathetic division, that's the one that's coming from the thoracolumbar region of the spine, so we also refer to it as the thoracolumbar division. So if you notice on the right-hand side, all those green neurons are all coming from the thoracic and the lumbar regions of the spine. Whereas the parasympathetic system is coming from the brainstem, but also in the sacral region. Okay, so we now call it the craniosacral division. Okay, so we'll go through those different regions and what they're innervating, but just remember the brainstem. What's coming off of the brainstem? Cranial nerves. Yeah, exactly. So these guys are running with those cranial nerves, or they are maybe the majority of the cranial nerve itself. So think of that, and we'll come back to that, okay? Our second difference is that the length of the postganglionic fiber is different between the two divisions. So in the sympathetic division, we have very long postganglionic fibers because the ganglions are located along the spinal cord. So the preganglionic fibers are pretty short. They're coming right off the spinal cord and synapsing in those ganglions just right along the spinal cord. There's also plexuses, and we'll talk about those plexuses in a minute. But the parasympathetic, they have very short postganglionic fibers. So these ganglions are actually located in or near the organ they're being innervated. So if you look at the colors on the right-hand side, the darker color is going to be that preganglionic fiber. And the lighter color is going to be the postganglionic fiber. And you notice those green ones are quite a lot longer on the sympathetic side. So our third difference between the divisions is the branching of fibers. And so in the sympathetic division, we have highly branched postganglionic fibers, so that these fibers can influence many organs at one time, which is really good if you want a very quick response, right? And that's important in our fight or flight response. Whereas in the parasympathetic system, we have very few branches because it's more of a localized effect, so it's just going to stimulate just that local organ or gland. Now, our fourth difference, I don't want you to worry as much about, but there is a difference in the neurotransmitter that is released in the two systems. So we said that acetylcholine is our kind of go-to neurotransmitter. It's our most common, and so that's what we see in our parasympathetic nervous system. But we use norepinephrine in our sympathetic system. And so norepinephrine is also secreted by the adrenal medulla along with epinephrine. So there are two hormones that are released in the adrenal gland, adrenal medulla. So let's first look at the parasympathetic division and a little bit more on the regions where those parasympathetic fibers are coming off the spinal cord. So we said that this is the craniosacral division. So we have a cranial outflow and a sacral outflow. So the cranial outflow is all originating from the brain, and more specifically the brain stem. So we're going to innervate organs of the head, neck, thorax, and abdomen. So pretty much the majority of the body. And if you can guess which cranial nerve goes to the abdomen and thorax, you might be correct in what cranial nerve we're talking about with the parasympathetic division. So it's really going to innervate the majority of the organs we're talking about from the cranial outflow. And then the sacral outflow is really just innervating some remaining distal abdominal organs, some distal GI, and our pelvic organs, so our reproductive organs and our urinary tract organs. So first, let's talk about that cranial outflow in a little more detail. So we said that those preganglionic fibers are going to run via those cranial nerves. So which cranial nerves are we talking about? So we're talking about oculomotor, which is cranial nerve 3. We're talking about the facial nerve, which is 7, and the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is 9. But the biggest nerve we'll really be talking about is the vagus nerve, okay, which innervates so many organs of the thorax and the abdomen. Now, the cell bodies of these preganglionic neurons are all located in the brainstem, and more specifically, the gray matter of the brainstem, because we said that the majority of cell bodies are going to live in the gray matter of the central nervous system. Of course, we're, not talking about ganglia at this time, but ganglia is also a place where the cell bodies live too, if we're talking about the peripheral nervous system. So let's go through these individual cranial nerves in a little bit more detail, and I'll tell you what I want you to know. So what I want you to know for these cranial nerves is that we're just going to kind of revisit what the parasympathetic functions of these cranial nerves are. Now, I don't want you guys to focus too much on the ganglion and what their names are and anything like that, even though I do have them listed. I don't want you to get too caught up on them, okay? So our oculomotor nerve, right, besides innervating all the skeletal muscles of the eye, or the majority of them, 4 out of the 6, we also innervate the smooth muscles of the eye, which causes that pupil constriction if we're talking about parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, so again, our preganglionic bodies, cell bodies, are in the midbrain. Okay, so midbrain of the brain stem. And then the postganglionic cell bodies are in the ciliary ganglion, but again, don't worry too much about the names of those ganglion, right? And then our facial nerve, so cranial nerve 7, even though we said that it's majority of our facial expression, right? So motor to our facial nerve, our facial muscles, we do have some stimulation of some glands in the head to secrete either our lacrimal glands, so tears, or our salivary glands for saliva. Okay, so again, don't worry too much about where these are coming from, but lacrimation and salivation are a little bit different, but we do have the preganglionic fibers in the pons, right, so of the brainstem as well. And then we have 2 different ganglia that our postganglionic fibers are coming from. So again, don't worry too much about that. So that's the pterygopalatine ganglion and the submandibular ganglion. So the glossopharyngeal, or cranial nerve 9, is going to stimulate secretion of another salivary gland, and that's the parotid gland. So again, that preganglionic neurons coming from the medulla, or the brainstem, to that otic ganglion, and then the postganglionic is going out to that parotid gland. But now, last but not least, is that vagus nerve, so cranial nerve 10, which is really one of our coolest, I think, cranial nerves, and it's very long, right? So it's starting in the medulla and the brainstem, and it goes all the way to our thorax and abdomen. So it innervates most of our visceral organs. So it's going to stimulate digestion, but it's also going to reduce heart rate and reduce blood pressure. So again, we're starting in the medulla, and then we're going out to the walls of all these organs. So the cell bodies of those postganglionic neurons are actually going to form what's called these intramural ganglia. So they're actually kind of within the organ itself. Okay, so that's just what we call these ganglia that live inside the organs. So let's talk a little bit more about the pathway of the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve actually sends branches through these autonomic nerve plexuses. So we talked a little bit about nerve plexuses when we talked about the somatic motor system, and the plexus is going to our upper limbs and lower limbs, right? The brachial plexus and the lumbosacral plexus. So it's kind of the similar idea. But we have what are called autonomic nerve plexuses. So again, don't worry too much about the names and everything. Just know that the vagus nerve does go through these autonomic nerve plexuses. So essentially, for a lot of the organs, we have a nerve plexus. So for the cardiac, for the heart, we have a cardiac plexus, lungs, pulmonary plexus, and then for our some of our abdominal organs, we have what's called the celiac plexus. So celiac usually refers to kind of the stomach region. And then we also have a superior mesenteric plexus, which is a lot of the digestive organs, such as the large and small intestine. So we'll finish off the parasympathetic system with the sacral outflow. So these neurons are emerging kind of from S2 to S4. Now again, the neurons themselves are actually located up in the lumbar region, but this is just where they're emerging from the spinal column. Okay, so we just have to remember that when we're talking about the spinal cord and spinal nerves. So these guys are going to innervate the organs of the lower abdomen and pelvis. Okay, so these preganglionic cell bodies are coming from the spinal gray matter, right? So we talked about our gray matter versus our white matter of the spinal cord. And these axons are going to kind of run through those ventral roots to the ventral rami. So remember we talked about our spinal cord and spinal roots and our spinal rami. So if you don't remember that, definitely go through that, right? So motor neurons are going to always go through the ventral roots, and then they're going to merge to form that spinal nerve, and then they're going to split again to our ventral and dorsal rami, just depending on where they're going. So if they're going the abdomen, they're going through that ventral rami. And these guys are going to kind of merge to form these pelvic splanchnic nerves. And don't worry too much about that. And just know these guys are going to go through some more, another plexus. So this is the inferior hypogastric plexus. And then they're going to go to their separate organs, right? So reproductive organs, urinary, and our distal digestive organs, okay? So they just have a little different way of doing it for these sacral outflow neurons. So now let's talk about the sympathetic division. So we called this division the thoracolumbar division as well, because all those preganglionic fibers are going to be coming from the thoracic region and kind of the proximal lumbar region of the spinal cord. So these guys, all these preganglionic fibers are going to come from that lateral gray horn of the spinal cord. So they're going to innervate visceral organs in the internal body, as well as some superficial body structures as well in the skin. So this is a little bit different from the parasympathetic because we do see some superficial innervation in the sympathetic nervous system. So we do have some more ganglia in the sympathetic system than we do in the parasympathetic system. So we have two types of ganglia in the sympathetic division. And the first type is called the sympathetic trunk ganglia. So we'll talk about that. Those ones are the ones that are close to the spinal cord. And then we also have the collateral ganglia, which are going to be in the abdomen, okay? So first, let's talk about the sympathetic trunk ganglia. So they're also called the chain ganglia or paravertebral ganglia. So I will usually refer to them as the sympathetic trunk ganglia, or maybe the chain ganglia is a shorter way to talk about it. But these guys are located on either side of the vertebral column. So they're going to run up and down on the left and right side of the vertebral column. And they're linked by these very short nerves into these sympathetic trunks. So you have ganglia and then a trunk and then another ganglia, okay? And then they're actually connected to our ventral rami by these short little fibers called the rami communicans. And we have a gray and a white rami communicans, but don't worry too much about the gray and the white. One's just kind of going to the ganglia, the other one's going away from the ganglia. So it's how we get our neuron to go through that sympathetic trunk. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about the connection with the ventral rami in a minute. So our second type of ganglia in the sympathetic nervous system are collateral ganglia. So these guys are a little bit different from our sympathetic trunk ganglia because they're unpaired. So whereas the sympathetic trunk ganglia run kind of in pairs up and down along the spinal column, these guys are unpaired. So they're just these single ganglia found within the abdomen and pelvis. Okay, so they're not in the thoracic cavity. So we have these main collateral ganglia, and you don't need to memorize all their names, but if you notice, the names look very familiar because they're the same as the parasympathetic plexuses that we just talked about. Okay, so yes, we had some parasympathetic plexuses in the thorax, but they don't have the collateral ganglia up there, only in the abdomen and pelvis. So the celiac, superior mesenteric, inferior hypogastric ganglia are the same as the plexuses. So these fibers are actually going to bypass the sympathetic trunk ganglia along the spinal cord and run with the associated parasympathetic plexus. And when we're talking about the abdomen, we're talking about the vagus nerve, right? So those vagus nerve plexuses. So now let's talk a little bit about the sympathetic pathways. So we're going to talk about where the preganglionic neurons are going to run and where the postganglionic neurons are going to run. And we'll talk about the differences between the sympathetic trunk ganglia, so what neurons are going to synapse on the trunk ganglia versus which neurons are going to synapse in the collateral ganglia. So when we talk about our preganglionic neurons, they're all going to start in the thoracolumbar region of the spine, and they'll send those motor axons through the ventral root. Okay, so remember, we're still talking about a motor system, right? So the autonomic nervous system is a motor system, so all the motor axons are running through the ventral root. Okay. Now all the roots are going to merge into spinal nerves, and then we're going to go out the ventral ramus, okay? So we're always going to go out the ventral ramus if we're going to the thorax or abdomen, right? So then we're going to go through that little connector, the ramus communicans, and more specifically the gray one, but don't worry as much about that. But we're going to go through that ramus communicans to connect up with our sympathetic ganglion. Okay, so that's our sympathetic trunk ganglion, the closest one to our spinal root exit, right, or spinal nerve exit of the vertebral column. So now our preganglionic pathway or axon can follow one of three pathways. Now the first one is that it can synapse with its postganglionic neuron in that sympathetic trunk ganglion at the same level where it exited. So that's this example, right? So the spinal nerve comes out the vertebral column at that level, and that's going to synapse right there at the nearest sympathetic trunk ganglion. Okay, so that is one pathway it can take, or we can take a couple other pathways. So what are those other two options for our preganglionic neuron? So the axon can either go up or down in that sympathetic trunk. So it won't synapse on the one that's the nearest to where it exits the spinal cord, but it could go up or down and synapse in another ganglion along the trunk. So maybe it needs to reach someplace up in the head or lower in the abdomen, right? Because if we're just starting in the thoracolumbar region, we have a lot that is above and below in the spinal cord from where we're exiting, right? So that's our second option. We can either ascend or descend in that sympathetic trunk. Or we can bypass the sympathetic trunk altogether. So it actually passes through and exits on a splanchnic nerve. So remember we talked about the splanchnic nerves in the parasympathetic system. So this would be somewhere in the lower lumbar region. Okay, lumbar to even sacral region. And these guys are the ones that are going to actually go out and synapse in a collateral ganglion. So we'll talk about these specifically as well. Okay, so these are the ones that are going to bypass the sympathetic trunk ganglion altogether and go synapse on a collateral ganglion. So the sympathetic system does innervate that body periphery, right? So we talked about that it's the only division that innervates the skin. It innervates the sweat glands, those erector pili muscles, and peripheral blood vessels. So we can either vasoconstrict or dilate those capillaries and vessels in the skin. So the parasympathetic does not innervate, right, the body periphery. So how do we get out to the body periphery? Well, we do it in one of two ways, right? So our preganglionic fibers are going to enter that sympathetic trunk and either synapse at that ganglion that's just right there at the exit, or say it's in the head region or in the lower body, we're going to ascend or descend that sympathetic trunk before we synapse. And then the postganglionic axon is just going to go out to the periphery, right? So pretty simple. So we can just take one of two pathways, right? So we'll either synapse right at the level where we exited, or we're going to ascend or descend depending on if we're going to the head or maybe the lower limbs, right, to the periphery of those regions. So this is just showing how these preganglionic and postganglionic neurons are going to be moving throughout that sympathetic trunk or chain ganglia. So if you're at that region or at that level, you can synapse right there, or you can go up and down that sympathetic trunk ganglia and synapse at a different ganglia. So just for an example, I circled the skin over there. So that might be the skin of the head, and you need to go up into the cervical region of the spinal cord before you synapse on that sympathetic trunk ganglia. So just an example of that. And then you can see those collateral ganglia down in the abdomen region. So we'll talk about a little bit about those as well. So now we can break up that picture a little bit more into a little bit more detail. So first we'll talk about how do we get to the head region, right? Because all of our preganglionic fibers are originating in the thoracic region. So they're going to have to ascend the sympathetic trunk and synapse in one of those superior cervical ganglia, which are higher up in the sympathetic chain ganglia. And then those postganglionic fibers are going to kind of run with associated large arteries. Okay, so they're not going to run with the cranial nerves like the parasympathetic system, but then they're going to go to the glands, smooth muscle, vessels, and skin of the head. Okay, so they're going to go to all those regions in the head. So how do we get to the thoracic organs? So we're pretty much maybe almost at the right level, right? So some fibers are going to synapse in the nearest sympathetic trunk ganglion, but maybe some have to travel a little bit upwards as well, ascend it a little bit too, to get to maybe the heart and the lungs. So the postganglionic fibers are going to run through these plexuses as well. So we have cardiac and pulmonary plexuses in the sympathetic system also. Now they're going to probably share a very similar area to the parasympathetic system, but again, we have plexuses in both systems. So these guys are going to go to the cardiac and pulmonary plexuses, which will go to the heart and the lungs. So we're going to increase that heart rate, dilate those bronchioles and blood vessels in the heart and lungs. But we're also going to inhibit a few things in this area too, such as glands, the esophagus, and digestive system. So now how do we get to the abdominal organs? So the preganglionic fibers are going to actually pass through the sympathetic trunk ganglion. So this is where we don't synapse on the sympathetic trunk ganglion. We actually pass through and travel through these splanchnic nerves. So they kind of converge onto these splanchnic nerves. Now again, you don't need to know the different splanchnic nerves, but just know that these preganglionic fibers are going to synapse in the collateral ganglias. Okay, and these are associated with the parasympathetic plexuses that we talked about earlier. And so then those postganglionic fibers are going to inhibit a lot of the activities in glands in the visceral organs. So again, in the abdomen, we don't need a lot of organs functioning in the sympathetic nervous system, right? Because we have a lot of digestive and urinary tract organs in the abdomen and pelvic regions, right? So we're going to mostly be inhibiting things in this area. So when we're talking about the pelvic organs, we have a couple different options. So some of the fibers, some of the preganglionic fibers are going to descend that sympathetic trunk to some lower sympathetic trunk ganglion, but others are just going to bypass the chain ganglia altogether and go out to those collateral ganglia. So we do have some collateral ganglia still within the pelvic region. So then all those postganglionic fibers are going to go to the bladder, reproductive organs, and large intestine. So again, we're doing a lot of inhibiting in this region as well, except maybe in the reproductive organs, we may have some stimulation. Okay, so very similar to the abdominal region, we just now have another option to actually synapse in the chain ganglia as well. So a little bit of both in the pelvic region. So now let's talk a little bit about that adrenal medulla, because we said that it's really a major organ of the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so the preganglionic sympathetic neurons actually bypass the sympathetic trunk altogether, and it synapses directly on the adrenal medulla. So there is no postganglionic neuron when we're talking about the adrenal medulla. So it's actually the largest sympathetic ganglion if you think about it that way, right? Because that preganglionic neuron is synapsing directly on the adrenal medulla. So it stimulates the adrenal medulla to secrete a lot of norepinephrine and epinephrine. So epinephrine, another name for it is adrenaline, and that's an older name for the hormone epinephrine. But essentially it's the major hormone of the sympathetic nervous system to really aid in that stress response, right? So adrenaline is really going to help the whole sympathetic division with that fight or flight response. So let's change gears a little bit and talk briefly about our visceral sensory neurons. So again, these guys are picking up on sensory receptors, right, in our visceral organs. So what are they monitoring? They're monitoring stretch, temperature, chemical changes, and irritation. So the cell bodies are all in the dorsal root ganglion because we're talking about the sensory system and the sensory neurons, and they all run through those dorsal root ganglia. So the cranial nerves that actually contain some general visceral sensory fibers are cranial nerve 9, which is our glossopharyngeal. So it's how we can sense kind of the tickling in the back of our throat in our as we swallow, things like that. And our vagus nerve is really the big one too for all the rest of our visceral organs. So what's really interesting about visceral sensation is we really don't sense visceral pain. So visceral pain is very interesting. So we actually don't sense pain when our visceral organs are cut, like surgical pain. Surgical pain is usually the integumentary system and the muscles, right, as they make the incision. But the internal organs actually don't feel cutting pain. What they do feel as pain is from chemical irritation and inflammation. So stretching as well. So visceral pain is very interesting because it's often perceived by our central nervous system as somatic in origin. So that's commonly referred to as referred pain. So when we feel what we think of as pain in maybe our arm region or our shoulder and neck region, it could actually be coming from a visceral organ. So this picture on the right hand side is just showing you that referred pain map. So essentially that is why when people are having heart attacks or pre-heart attacks, they actually feel pain in their left arm because that's all referred pain. So down the left arm, that can be coming from the heart itself. So another thing is, if you notice, the stomach could be also in different areas as well. And the gallbladder. So I had my gallbladder removed, and I actually felt pain in my right shoulder, which they warned me about, but it is very strange that yes, you can feel pain kind of locally as well in that right upper quadrant of your abdomen, but then you also feel this weird shoulder pain, which is the referred pain. So just kind of these weird regions on our body that we feel as somatic pain, but really it's just referred visceral pain. So again, you can kind of look through that. It's interesting. I'm not going to ask you any specific things about the, referred pain map, but I want you to know what referred pain is, okay, and what kind of visceral pain we feel. Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about the central nervous system and its control over the autonomic nervous system. So we don't have direct voluntary control, but the central nervous system does control the autonomic nervous system. So when we talked about the cerebral cortex, we really said that it's the house of our conscious brain, right? But we do have some subconscious communication between the cerebral cortex, the limbic system, and the hypothalamus. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute and how there is some subconscious and maybe a little bit of voluntary control sometimes. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But the real main player here is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is really the boss over the whole autonomic nervous system, okay? And it communicates with the brainstem and the spinal cord, and we'll talk about how those guys control the autonomic nervous system in a minute. So first, let's talk about the hypothalamus and its communication with the limbic system. So it's really the main integration center for the autonomic nervous system. So it directs the sympathetic and parasympathetic functions. But it does communicate with the limbic system, specifically the amygdaloid body, and you don't really need to know the specifics of the limbic system, but just know that it's really the main region for emotion. So you do have some subconscious communication with the limbic system for like some emotional input of the autonomic nervous system, okay? And we'll talk about why that's important in a minute. So we do have some control over the autonomic functions. So you can convince your autonomic nervous system to go one way or the other. So essentially you can have some calming feelings during meditation. So you can actually have some influence of the cerebral cortex on the parasympathetic centers in your hypothalamus. So essentially, meditation does work, right? So you can actually convince your autonomic nervous system that you're more in a parasympathetic state, so you have a feeling of calm and relaxation. Now, you can also stall the visceral reflexes, and we'll talk about the visceral reflexes from the spinal cord in a minute, but essentially defecation and urination happen through a spinal cord reflex. It's why babies, have no control over defecation and urination, because it's just a reflex, right? It's a reflexive behavior. So we do have some control, right? So you really gotta go, but you can control when you go the majority of the time, right? Obviously, there are some incidences where you can't control the reflex, but usually we can stall the reflex until we find a bathroom. Now, you can also have a voluntary sympathetic response. So this is really where scaring comes into play, where you get really scared. So you can recall a scary event or watch a scary movie, something like that, where you communicate with the limbic system, and so you get that emotional overhaul of your system, and you can put yourself into a sympathetic response, essentially put yourself in a sympathetic way, just like you can do the opposite, right? So you can put yourself into a parasympathetic state, but you can do it either way, okay? So, and again, these are, very mild control over the autonomic nervous system, right? But some of us can do this better than others, I would say, versus, no control. So now let's talk about the brainstem and spinal cord, okay? So the brainstem really houses the reticular formation, right? So the reticular formation, we said, exerts the most direct influence over a lot of the autonomic nervous system, okay? So it controls pupil size, heart rate, blood pressure, airflow, salivation, etc. And so obviously this is all under the control of the hypothalamus, but it has the most direct influence over what is actually happening, okay? So the hypothalamus directs it, and the brainstem is what initiates it and what makes it happen. And then the spinal cord is for those reflexes. So reflexes for urination, defecation, as well as erection and ejaculation. So any sort of reflex you can think of is happening through the spinal cord. Okay, and again, it's all kind of under the control. There's kind of a trickle-down system here through the central nervous system, but again, you have very little voluntary control over a lot of these systems. So now just some examples of some disorders of the autonomic nervous system. And the first one we're going to talk about, I actually have, which is Raynaud's phenomenon. And it's a hyperactivation of the sympathetic nervous system. So what happens is the peripheral fingers and toes actually turn white and even purple through a constriction of blood vessels in the peripheral circulatory system. And it can be brought on by exposure to cold or even emotional stress. So essentially your body is kind of overacting to this not very extreme stress, right? So essentially it's putting you into a more extreme stress than you need to be. And so that is Raynaud's. So you kind of get these white fingertips or even purple to a certain degree. Another one is congenital megacolon, also called Hirschsprung's disease. And essentially it's a birth defect where the parasympathetic innervation of the distal large intestine, or the colon, fails to develop correctly. So essentially you're unable to contract the smooth muscles of that distal colon, and so feces and gas can accumulate proximally to the defect where you can't contract those smooth muscles and move the feces and gas through the colon. So now let's look at a little bit of development of the autonomic nervous system. So if we look, remember our neural tube versus our neural crest cells. So the neural tube is essentially going to develop into the spinal cord and brain, right? The central nervous system. Whereas the neural crest cells, we essentially said we're eventually going to become the dorsal root ganglion, where those sensory neuron cell bodies live, right? So if we talk about our preganglionic neurons of the autonomic nervous system, they're all going to develop from that neural tube, right? And then our postganglionic neurons are going to come from the neural crest. Okay, so essentially, how do we develop into these different ganglia if we're talking about the sympathetic nervous system? Some of those cells are going to migrate ventrally from the neural crest, okay, and they're going to form the sympathetic trunk ganglion. Okay. And then some are going to migrate even further to become the collateral ganglia. Okay, so essentially we have these ganglia in the autonomic nervous system, and they're all ultimately coming from that neural crest, which we said was going to develop just into the dorsal root ganglion, but we also are going to develop these other ganglia as well. Now, the autonomic nervous system definitely declines with advancing age, the efficiency of the autonomic nervous system, so you don't have as big of a sympathetic response. That's definitely a big thing, but also the parasympathetic system can have some trouble as well, which is why you can kind of see either constipation or less control over those reflexes, right? So sometimes older people have accidents, right? Urinary and defecation accidents. So again, we get a little bit of this decline in the autonomic nervous system. So here are our learning objectives for this lecture. So make sure you go through these and double check everything, and make yourself a study guide for the upcoming exam. All right, so just a reminder, we have our next exam coming up. I know this has been a long unit, so we're covering chapters 12 through 17, which is the nervous system, special senses, and endocrine system. So we'll start into the circulatory system with chapter 19. So we're going to actually skip 18 for now and start into the heart next week. And here are some review questions if you want some more study questions to review for the exam, and the answers again for the multiple choice are in your textbook. So hopefully they will help you out, and hopefully I'll see you guys in office hours this week. getting ready for the upcoming exam. All right, talk to you guys later. Bye.